One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs. Welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We've got a great show for you today. We've got Simmone Taitt, who runs HeartSpace New York Consulting. Now, Simmone is a sales consultant. She's run sales teams at places like Gilt City, Jet Setter, in addition to Kidpass, and now she runs her own consulting business. Simmone's also, as you can tell, a woman and a black woman, a person of color. And we talk a little bit about building diversity into your hiring practices and building diversity into your company. And it's really, it's both difficult and simple. And Simmone has a lot of insightful comments and a lot of important insights about how exactly to do that and how to make sure that you're building and leaning into diversity and not just paying lip service to it. She talks about how companies that embrace diversity tend to generate 20% more revenue per year than competitive companies that do not embrace diversity. And that's based on some recent studies. So listen on to hear this great interview. Now, before we dive into that interview, of course, we want to thank our sponsors. We've got two big sponsors. The first is Chorus. That's Chorus.ai, the leading conversation intelligence platform for high-growth sales teams. Chorus records, transcribes, and analyzes business conversations in real time to coach reps on how to become top performers. With Chorus, more reps meet quota, new hires ramp faster, leaders become better coaches, and everyone in the organization can collaborate over the actual voice of the customer. So check out chorus.ai/saleshacker to see what they're up to. Our second sponsor is Outrage. Outrage is the leading sales engagement platform. Outrage supports sales reps by enabling them to humanize communications at scale, from automating the soul-sucking manual work that eats up selling time to providing action-oriented tips on what communications are working best. Outrage has your back. So check out outrage.io/saleshacker to learn more about Outrage. Outrage is building something really, really powerful. We had Manny Medina at a Revenue Collective. Manny's the CEO at a Revenue Collective dinner recently, and he's just an incredibly charismatic but also visionary CEO. The company is on an IPO path, and we're excited to partner with him. Lastly, we want to thank some of the fans that have reached out. We're now well over 100 people that have taken the time to specifically reach out to me on LinkedIn and mention the podcast. 4 folks that have reached out recently: Ollie Campbell, Chad Nuss, who actually is looking forward to collaborating on some other areas, Yen Henschel, and then somebody named Chris Rocks, who hopefully, Chris, if that's your real name, Mazel Tov, and if it's not your real name, that's also cool. It's an interesting talking point no matter what happens. So thank you for reaching out. Without further ado, let us listen to Simmone Taitt from HeartSpace Consulting talk about what she does and why she does it so well. Thanks for listening.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs. Welcome back to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We are incredibly excited today to have Simmone Taitt on the show. Simmone is a recent new member of the New York City Revenue Collective, but more importantly than that, she is an acknowledged sales innovation and growth strategy leader here in the New York tri-state area. She may have clients, which she'll tell us about, that extend well beyond New York. But let me tell you a little bit about her background before we start chatting with her. She spent the last 14 years joining early stage startups like Gilt Group, Spa Finder, Spa Booker, she'll tell us if there's different things, and Kidpass, with ownership over the go-to-market strategy and also creating diverse sales teams to drive revenue during those early critical days of growth. So right now she's running HeartSpace NY. It's a collaborative consulting agency focused on helping companies reach their fullest potential stage by stage with breaking revenue barriers, accelerating growth, and investing in healthy sales ecosystems. Simmone, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Sam. I'm really excited to be here and to join you.
Well, the excitement is mutual. So we know that your name is Simmone Taitt, and we know that you're the founder and principal of HeartSpace NY Consulting. But what is HeartSpace NY Consulting? And tell us a little bit about your mission and about what you're focused on and sort of how you do what you do.
Yeah, sure. So HeartSpace is really a passion project. And I would say for a long time, I was consulting. I'm an advisor at some of the best tech accelerators here in New York. And I always found that really rewarding for me to be involved in. And as an advisor, then going to a consultant and thinking through what that meant for me, having a background in building early stage startups in seed or Series A, and very much understanding those critical first days especially from the sales side and especially from a growth and revenue side, and how important it is to start filling coffers pretty early and to also build great teams to do so. When I launched HeartSpace, it was the intention of, instead of being at a company for 1 or 2 or 3 years doing this, to have an impact across multiple companies. The one thing that I know for sure is working with startups and also having specific projects or goals that you have to work toward, really staying in the trenches with our clients, that was really important to me. And really core to the mission was also putting the heart, the actual heart, and how we lead and where we should be leading from in putting teams together in those first days, having that as a part of the mission to help companies think from a more intuitive sense, to be able to tackle whatever issues they're having up front in the sales cycle and in growth, and to also really put a focus on the people. So we are now very proud to have reached just over the year mark in anniversary, but with many of our clients being at this point global and also right here in New York. So really important for HeartSpace in terms of growth and what it means to be helping startups.
So you've mentioned sort of intuition, and you've mentioned putting the heart. What does that mean to you specifically? What are you contrasting this positioning to? I'm just curious. And what are the specific tactics that you're introducing to your clients that bring this element of perhaps empathy or heart or intuition into the consulting that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Having an emotional quotient and a high one for many leaders, and there have been so many interviews with great women leaders like Ursula Burns from oh goodness, I'm losing her company. I can't believe it anyway. And Sheryl Sandberg, of course, at Facebook. But there are a lot of leaders that want to lead from an intuitive place. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's part of everyone's DNA. And I do recognize that. If someone were to ask me, what is my superpower would be intuition. And from a place of making decisions that make sense for a company, that's not always tied to the top or the bottom line. That's not always tied to having pressure from the board or VCs, but that's really intuitive and in sync with where your business is today and where it needs to go. And as a leader, sometimes following your intuition can be a risk. But there's that gut sense, which is another word for intuition, I think really leads me. It's led some of my best managers that I've had and CEOs and founders that I've observed over these many years. And so intuition is super important. That is, I think, directly correlated with the heart and what it means to be a heart-led leader. And so empathy is a big part of that, really understanding and managing to the individual and also making decisions, especially in those early days and as the company evolves, that put the people at the center of the decisions that you're making for a healthy ecosystem. And I say a healthy sales org specifically, with a tremendous amount of pressure to be a revenue contributor. But there's another side of that, which is we are human, and also leading and hearing from the heart, I think, really helps in making decisions that we wouldn't make otherwise under different circumstances.
Can you give us a few examples, like specific examples when you're describing this framework? What are some examples from your consulting business? We can redact the names, but that demonstrate, not just focusing on the numbers, but putting humans at the center. Are there instances that come to mind?
Yeah, there are. There's a great company that focuses on women typically going through their core customers, really a woman that is going through a divorce or has just finished going through a divorce. And contractually speaking, if there is a ring involved, that being an engagement ring or a wedding band, that belongs to the person who fulfilled that contract in marriage. And now the woman has this ring. And what we don't realize and what we're not necessarily thinking about is what it means for a healthy financial future, right? To drop the karma of a divorce and move on in life, your ring can be a great asset and a great financial asset. And having those conversations from the sales org to the customer or the client, there has to be a high level of empathy there, right? A high level of understanding, and that emotional quotient comes into play with every single interaction for that sales team, by the way, and helping them along with their scripts and what it means to connect with a customer when actually, the bottom line is to get that ring in so that they can help to sell that on a very large private market. It takes out the guesswork for the customer. There are all these steps, but usually in that first call with that woman, you're not necessarily just throwing all of the logistics out to them. You're listening, you're taking a beat, you're understanding. And even if you don't understand, which is what I, trained the sales team on, the best thing that you can do is listen. And we know, in sales, that 80-20 rule, 80% listening most of the time will get you the answers that you need to really get to connecting with that customer and moving things forward in the sales cycle. So that's a very emotional sale. There's nothing around it. Whether it's a good divorce or a bad divorce, leading with the heart there and coming from a place where empathy matters. That's just one example of one of our clients that we helped along and where that really came into play, core to our mission at HeartSpace.
So this is a business that resells specifically marital property, or it's just resells jewelry, but one of the big pieces of inventory or one of the big verticals is engagement rings, this is a fascinating business.
Isn't it fascinating? I think it's great, actually, which is one of the big reasons why I wanted to work with them and why I thought there was a lot there to work on, actually. And so, no, it's not just engagement rings, although diamonds are a big part of what they do, of course. It is all jewelry. So it's across everything. Some of their core customers, that being the divorced woman, but categorically speaking, think about real estate and what happens when you have estate jewelry.
Of course.
Folks pass on, so inheritors. And there are all sorts of other things, collectors who have been collecting or swap in that, jewelry space with really valuable goods. But diamonds are a girl and I guess a guy's best friend at times. And certainly there is, gender equality with diamonds. Everyone loves a good diamond, but that's what they do. And it is fascinating. And they do have a closed network of buyers. It's a tech company. HeartSpace, we currently only work with tech companies. That has been our core customer and our core client. And everything that happens is via an online auction. But there is that human part of it. You're not doing everything online. You have access to someone to help you through that process and to really understand this valuable that you have that also has emotional value to it, and hopefully sending that person on a brighter way in their future.
Does the sales team have alerts that are triggered by divorce filings, and that's how they figure out who to call?
No. Although that's not a bad idea.
It's a very depressing idea, but
I will share that with the CEO and the GM. The leadership team over there would love that. Is there a mechanism that can do that? Anyway, no. Most of what they're doing is actually all inbound, right? So people are finding them. They have a tremendous, in my opinion, they have a great marketing approach, and also social media campaigns and that sort of thing. So they're targeting their customer in a great way with messaging that's along the lines of have you thought about what happens next in your life? Because that is a big part of it. What happens next in your life, it can a lot of times be, tied to a healthy financial future and having a little bit of a boost, to get there. So, yeah.
Okay. Let's go back a little bit. You've been doing this. You've been in startup land for 14 years. How did you get into HeartSpace? First of all, where are you from originally? Where'd you grow up?
Oh, I am a proud New Englander. I was born and raised in Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, actually. And if you blink, you'll miss it. But it is it is actually the largest city in Western New England. I grew up right down the street from the Basketball Hall of Fame, which is what I think we're most famous for. And Dr. Seuss is also from Springfield. So that's where I'm from. Yeah.
I love Dr. Seuss.
Yeah.
And so you're from New England. Where'd you go to undergrad? Or, to walk us through a little bit of, the college and the growing up experiences, and then how you ended up in startup land and sort of the core professional experiences that ultimately form the foundation for HeartSpace.
Oh, yeah, of course. That's, for me, and Regina King, who is the actress that just won an Oscar, African-American actress that just won her Oscar for supporting roles. She said, I'm a product of all the love being poured into me. And that was my childhood. I had all the love. I have an older brother and sister. They're much older than me, though, 8 and 10 years older than me. And so by the time I was kind of coming into my own, they were both off in college. And so I just had the attention of my mom and dad, which was great. But I was what some people might call a really tenacious child, in that I was always going after different things. I was very interested, very curious. That has followed me into, my adulthood, and I think is a core part of just my DNA. I was lucky enough, and my mom is actually an immigrant to the country. So when she came to the country, I was nowhere in the purview, but there was, in my house anyway, a very constant reminder that we had everything that we needed to do well in school. And so school was a core part of everything that I needed to do. I just had to make my bed every day and go to school. And here's the thing, they didn't say go to school and get straight A's. I mean, I think that would have been their dream, but I was a different kind of child. I was passionate about the things that I loved or that I wanted to know more about. And so I tried all sorts of things. I went, into theater, and I played the piano. I'm a classically trained pianist. I played the piano for almost 16 years before, I decided to not continue with lessons. But, I was into so many different things. And I will say that was just fostered into me because I know for sure my parents treated me as an individual, and they saw that I was a little bit different. I like to talk a lot. I had never had an issue with getting, on stage and speaking my mind in a way that I don't know that, my brother or sister were doing. So I was just, very much encouraged. And also by the time I got into middle school, my parents were able to afford to send me to a private school. And so although I didn't board, I went to the McDuffie School in Springfield, Massachusetts. I didn't board. I lived 5 minutes away. I had a much different experience. I was surrounded by students who were boarding from all over the world by languages and different cultures. And so by the time I got to college, and I'm a proud graduate of Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, a proud leopard, by the time I got to college, I tried to keep that same energy into college. But, we're going to skip the college years, not for anything except for, I think the most interesting thing about college for me was the time that I spent off of campus. So I was very involved, but I also, studied abroad. My father got very ill when I was in my freshman year of college, which then set me on a path to understanding what it meant to take care of myself. And my family did an incredible job getting me through college. I was, the last one. But even so, it's kind of those rose-colored glasses came off, and I was very, very close with my father. And I realized that there were, books to be bought, for school for the first time, and clothes and meal plans and all these things. And I decided in college to start babysitting. And what actually happened, I think what most people know me for, is I started to outsource babysitting jobs to other women that I was in college with. And then I had kind of this ring of babysitters, and then I would take a revenue share. I would think that's probably my first foray into sales. But after I left college, I thought I actually was going to go into politics. I was a law major. I was very much in tune with, saving the world and, getting peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to all the starving children in the world. And that took a turn for me, because what I realized really quickly is that law school was just not the place that I was going to be successful. And I started to think about, okay, well, what's the safest thing for me to do? And I actually went to a Fortune 500 company. I went to Saks Fifth Avenue in their buying organization. I think most people don't realize, and this is kind of the second stepping stone, I think, into my career in sales, but in the buying office, it's all highly quantitative. Like it's numbers all day long. You're moving inventory, you're exercising different parts of your brain and making sure that there's sell through, there's an open to buy. So I got very comfortable with numbers very early on in my career. And I do believe that's a strong, strong premise to also being equal brained in sales, right? So being able to build relationships with people and understanding how to solve for your customer, but also understanding the business side. And I was very lucky that way, because I did get that training early on, but didn't find retail to be the most nurturing place for me. And soon after, I would say about 3 years or so into being at Saks, I had a conversation with an alum from Lafayette. And he put me in touch with a woman that was sitting on the board of Spa Finder. And Spa Finder at the time was a print magazine, if you can believe it. And and I will tell you the distinction between Spa Finder and Spa Booker in a minute, but Spa Finder was a print magazine, and Pete and Susie Ellis came in. And Pete he used to always say the internet is like the wild, wild west right now. Online digital media was really coming to the forefront as something that you can measure for brands and report back on. He saw this vision. He had this vision. And I went to Spa Finder pretty early on. I had to really explain to everyone that I was leaving a Fortune 500 company with great benefits and, company name that everyone knew to go to. At the time, Spa Finder was definitely less than 50 people, and that I was jumping into sales, and that's what I really wanted to do. And needless to say, I got to Spa Finder, and it switched very quickly from a print magazine, which they still had once a year as a guide, but to selling online media ads. And I totally got hooked onto being able to contribute every day, with my voice being heard, with working in small teams, with having a lot of autonomy to manage my relationships and find new relationships and be a full cycle salesperson. And that really was my first startup in sales job. I was very grateful for Spa Finder for that reason, because I was young. I was in my early 20s, but I was literally flying all over the world. I was managing the West Coast for quite some time. And so I was flying out there and working with our hospitality partners, very large accounts. I'm talking about like the Four Seasons and Canyon Ranch. And at that point, spas were also very focused on wellness. So not just the luxury of spas, which didn't seem like an accessible market, but also really focusing on mind-body wellness and moving more in that direction. So I always say I wish I was a little bit older to understand what a good massage really means. But that was a little difficult for me to understand when I was 24 or 25. And I've always looked a bit more mature than I am. And so, they would send me to these conferences and I would be in front of clients. And, I distinctly remember, people saying to me, well, when you get to this point in life, and they were well into their late 30s or 40s. And, here I was 20, 25 or so. But I always put the customer first. And that was always interesting to me, the relationship and problem solving and getting really creative with them. And then on the other side, being in sales and knowing that every part of my contribution, I was also getting some of that back. Right. So
Yeah.
it was a super healthy culture at Spa Finder in that way. And I think that autonomy really, pushed me into my next things, which I was living at San Francisco. I had actually moved from New York to San Francisco. And that I was there for about 6 months. And because I'm just a master networker, your network is so important. And I had met this guy and was introduced to him about a year prior. And he had just launched a company called Jet Setter. And Jet Setter was the second property of Gilt Group. And I came back to New York and we had coffee. We had coffee in his office, and people just basically sitting on top of each other, right? Because there were so many people in the office. You could tell a startup that was growing very quickly. And, he said, look, you have not only all of these huge hospitality clients, but they're our target customer. And at that point I was managing a small team for Spa Finder. And he's like, look, we need someone to build out that org for us. We need someone to really focus also on the partnerships. We're early stage, but we've got funding and we have Gilt Group, kind of like the mothership, and we're doing incredible things, but you need to move back to New York. And I said, look, I just moved to San Francisco, 6 months ago. I'm very happy there. And he said, you know what? Okay, fine. Well, we're launching another company. And that company is Gilt City. And if you have a couple of minutes, I would love for you to connect with the president. And this all happened on a Wednesday. I ended up having a conversation, no resume, no anything, as these things go. And it happened on a Wednesday. I had an offer by Friday. And I just remember saying, this is not a rocket ship that I need to be on that, So I went to Gilt City and I was their first hire outside of the New York office. I subsequently, over the 4+ years that I was at Gilt, built out our West Coast markets. Those sales teams was one of the top revenue contributors, came back to New York, built an entirely new sales org for Gilt. And we went into tertiary markets, and it was an incredible time to be at Gilt, which was one of the unicorns, in New York at that time, with, Kevin Ryan at the helm and Alexis and Alexandra. It was an incredible ride while I was there.
Yeah, I remember watching, I guess, Gossip Girl and seeing there's big, heavy Gilt sponsorship. So there was always Gilt boxes coming in through those very fancy apartments. Thank you for that background. The question I have, which is just sort of, I think, one of the points of focus and emphasis for your career, but as a woman and as a person of color in a male-dominated industry, what's been your experience? I'm just, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion on sort of a superficial or generic level many times, but you face many of these issues on a daily basis, and you probably face them even more so as a 25-year-old first joining Spa Finder. Mm-hmm. So I guess one question is, what has been your experience over the last couple of years as both a woman and a person of color dealing with so many different both buyers and then managers and founders, and just in a world where it's a lot of white men that are making the decisions? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked me that question, Sam, because not only is it really important for companies of all sizes, but also being really intentional in the early days for startups about what diversity means for them. And for me, what it meant coming from my background is, I have to be honest, you couldn't tell me that I was being treated any differently in those early years. And part of it was my own, well, I can say this about myself, but my own ignorance to what the industry was actually becoming and what it looked like before I moved to San Francisco. So when I was here in New York, Spa Finder, although, a really healthy culture there, I was totally unleashed and felt such a sense of autonomy. There were very little times that I was getting a no, right, to either my ideas or things that I wanted to pursue or anything that I wanted to introduce into the ecosystem as a new way of selling when I started managing people. So that was a very nurturing environment where being a woman and a woman of color, and let me be really clear here, it is not always easy to make the distinction in discrimination if that's happening, bias or unconscious bias, when I have both going for me, which are both amazing things, by the way. I love being a woman and I love being a woman of color, right? So, but it's hard to make that distinction and say, okay, it's one over the other unless it's super blatant. And some of those blatancies started to occur for me as I went from just being a salesperson, right? Individual contributor, just salesperson, kind of low on the totem pole, to going on that career jungle gym and going into leadership positions. And it became really apparent. I spent some time in enterprise sales for a pure tech company. Very, very apparent when I was dealing with and working with companies that were, not as progressive, that have been around forever. And that was the end customer, that wouldn't even take meetings with me unless I had my, founder or counterpart who was either white male or white woman, CC'd. In the age of social media and LinkedIn, obviously being able to immediately look someone up. I mean, there are some, I'll use two examples, one internal, one external. But there was a point in which I was working with business analysts and, I understand numbers very well. And so my analyst would actually, just confirm everything. And I had a weekly meeting in which I had to present. And every single week, the same person, which happened to be, a man, a white man, the same person would question my numbers week over week over week. Now, at this point, I was managing a thriving team, but it was at some points felt very intentional. And then I kind of realized, I don't even think he knows that he's doing this, which is where I learned what unconscious bias was, actually. There's another instance in which I, was sitting in an executive meeting and I'm, on my laptop, there's a sticker that just has the word girls in it. I'm not going to mention the company's name. And, the CTO slams his computer shut and he said, I'm not going to sit in this meeting with like a sticker like that because this company, that's not what this company is. What if I had a sticker that said, blank, blank white male? I ended up leaving that company about a month later.
And so what is your answer, your perspective to that CTO is don't worry about it? Or
oh, no.
I guess what was your answer in that moment?
Oh, yeah, no, that was, and, I just started talking about this particular story recently more publicly because it happens so much. And And I didn't know it was happening. I mean, early on, I really didn't know that scenarios like this were even allowed. And I will say part of it is because you are moving so fast at lightning speed when you're building a startup. If you're doing it right, there is very, very, very little room for ego, very little room for minutia things that are distracting. Well, this wasn't minutia. It wasn't distracting. At that point, I had heard enough stories. I had been through enough of my experiences. And actually, interestingly enough, that particular company was actually female founded. It was a woman founder. And it was, one, uncomfortable. My response was, so let me just be clear, because it just so happened that sticker was also representing one of our investors. So I said, let me be clear. Is it because it has the word girls in it? Because this is one of our investors. You and I would not be sitting here with a job if we weren't being funded by VCs and firms that were invested in women. So I just want to be clear there. He refused to answer the question. He said he's not getting into that HR loop. Okay. So that was that response. And I wasn't reactive. I'm actually pretty good in conflict, especially conflict conversations and resolutions. Again, coming from, that place of heart and empathy and really wanting to understand. But sometimes the resolution is to leave. And I didn't leave reactively. I had the conversation and I said, I cannot work with someone who I know doesn't respect me, has very little dignity in the work that we're trying to accomplish together. But overall, I think, especially for the company, that just wasn't an authentic, I could not represent myself authentically. In other words, I couldn't just show up as a woman and a Black woman every day, right? That in and of itself was an issue. So I did exit.
I have sort of two questions, and I think the answers will be probably extensive. The first is around this concept of unconscious bias, and particularly as cultural norms and cultural awareness evolve and shift. And as you know, since we've met in person, I'm a white man. What's your advice to folks like me that want, first of all, I try to bring as much empathy and heart into nearly every interaction that I can. Sometimes, my temper in a different setting might get the better of me, but generally I'm trying to bring my very best self into every interaction. But I'm sure that there are still times when I do something wrong, I say something wrong. The example that's on my mind these days is the phrase "you guys" as a euphemism for all of the people,
Sure.
Which increasingly feels like that's not probably the right way to address a large group of people, since frankly, most of them aren't guys. But what's your advice for how we should address unconscious bias and how we should try to ensure that we don't do something wrong, we don't offend somebody unintentionally, even if we have the best intentions at heart?
Yeah. So, Sam, I'm sure on behalf of many, many of your listeners, they are so happy that you've asked that question. And so, therefore, on behalf of many, many of your listeners, I am one voice, right? I am one voice, and I am representative, but I am one voice. And I think that's exactly where it starts. I've said you need to be managing to the individual, really understand people on your team and what drives them, what, encourages them, what rewards. I look at building diverse teams and focusing on diversity almost exactly the same, right? And that is, I don't mean just racially diverse. I mean diverse backgrounds, diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, diverse schools. I was at an event last night and, someone said, look, everyone on my team is from, Connecticut or New York, right? And that is actually a point of diversity or a lack of diversity, I should say. And so part of what you say, I want to say, it really starts in how you're hiring. And there's this whole, and I'm just going to debunk it right now, and I may get some mail over this, but that it's a pipeline issue. And primarily, it is not a pipeline issue. Primarily, it is a hiring issue when you get to either the hiring managers, middle management hiring managers, going through the interview process. Unconscious bias is a part of all of us. There are, stereotypes and influences that we've had our entire lives. And so it starts from self. It starts from you, knowing that you may have an unconscious bias or a few. Really understanding that and being aware, I think, is definitely the first step. Secondly, it is how you are hiring and asking those questions in the interview process, in the hiring process. That's not isolating someone with a more diverse background or someone that looks different than everyone else on the team, but making sure that you're, uncovering and also being really honest about things like, we pride ourselves on having a diverse company, or we are working really hard to make that happen, right? I think also, no matter what, is having uncomfortable conversations is not always a liability. And you can quote me on that, right? I think a really good manager and good leadership and colleagues and peers, peer-to-peer influence especially, we are living in the same world around us. We might view it differently, but we are all sharing this space. And so having those conversations about and being very intentional in the conversations with an endpoint of, we are lacking diversity. That is an issue for us because it does truly affect revenue. Forbes had a great article last summer, and the Boston Consulting Group, their results were out of about 1,700 companies that having a diverse team is about a 19%, they have 19% higher revenue than other companies that don't have diverse teams. So it's not just worth the investment, right, to bring in women and people of color, but it actually directly affects the top and bottom line. And so people like you, right, and colleagues and the human to human interaction that needs to happen actually needs to happen in exactly this way. Ask the question, how can I do better? Or, look, I actually think I'm doing pretty well. I would like to be able to influence more those around me that look like me. How does that happen? And it's not looking to the one Black person or one Latina person, or, it's actually it has to be a broader conversation within an organization and a commitment to not avoiding what shouldn't be an elephant in the room, right? Really be intentional there.
It's hard. And I think one of the things that sometimes is hard is this double awareness that I'm nervous to presume too much because I really don't have the experience of being a Black woman, obviously. And, in many ways, every door has been open for me. And so I'm super conscious that I don't want to overextend it. At the same time, I'm also nervous sometimes, or I want to make sure that it's also that I'm being treated as fairly, but which I'm sure I am being treated as fairly. I'll give you a specific example, which is not related to sales or hiring or anything.
Sure.
I'm in the movie theater with my wife, and there's a group of young women, and they're talking very loudly, and they were talking through the previews. And if you've watched any of the messages from the movie theaters, they don't want people talking during the movie, and I personally get really frustrated. So I lean over and I say, I hope that you'll stop talking when the movie begins. And the woman leans over to me and says, I bet you wouldn't have said that to me if I were a man. And I ended up thinking about it because maybe she's right. But on the other hand, I really don't, I didn't have a point of view on her gender. It was more that I just don't like people that talk during the movies. And I guess the point I'm making is sometimes I'm trying my best, and then it feels like you're still slapped on the wrist, and I guess that can be a frustrating experience. Not that she was a spokesperson for all women or all Black women or anybody, right? She's just a kid in a movie theater. But I think that's some of the challenge, which is trying to understand, where am I overstepping? Where is it appropriate? And how do I develop a sense of confidence when clearly, when you look back on things that people used to do, those things are not appropriate and were not appropriate. And yet those people felt comfortable in the moment. So I don't really know if I have a question, more just a statement.
Well, no. So I hear you on the statement, and thank you for sharing that scenario. The one big thing, if we can take anything away from this part of the conversation, is I have to encourage myself every day to show up as my authentic self. Right. And so I encourage everyone around me to do the same. And you're totally right. It goes beyond professional. It goes beyond your office work environment. It is how you are showing up every single day as a global citizen, as a person that is walking through this world with hopefully other people that are also striving to be their most authentic self. And when you are able to get to that point, right, and it's evolving, but when you are there, you certainly cannot control anyone else's responses, but you can control how you show up. So if you're constantly and consistently the person who is showing up and saying, that doesn't feel right, that doesn't look right, that's not sitting well with me, we need to do more diversity training, not just one big day where you shut down the company. You have it one time every 10 years, when things happen, really being intentional, both in your home space and also in your workspace, only comes from when you're showing up your authentic self. And believe me, there are plenty of people who are their authentic selves, and it's very hard to understand their point of view, right? Like, that it doesn't make it any easier just because I'm saying be authentic. I want you to be authentic so that I know, where we connect or where we do not connect at all. And so that I would just say to that, you can, and here's a really practical thing. And it's just one very good example. So in the US anyway, about 10% of board seats are not filled, yet they're less than, I think the stat is like 10% of women don't even sit on boards, for-profit boards, right? And so it's very well known that it's what they call a boys network. And so what would happen if these board seats were filled, not just filled, but actually filled with women of color, people of color in general, right? Making diversity really matter at the board level. I mean, I gave the stat about that 19% more revenue for companies that just invest in diversity and have diverse teams. Can you imagine what would happen at the board level? And so, being the person that's able to affect that change and just make the recommendation could be you, Sam, right? It could be someone that looks like you. So instead of putting, the next guy up for it, you're actually very intentionally and committing to choosing a woman from your network who is able and, ready to take on something like that. Even speaking engagements, making sure that there are women on panels. I went to a conference a couple of years ago, a sales conference actually, there were about 350 executives. They didn't even take the easy way out. They didn't even have a woman as the moderator. There were no women at all on any of their panels all day long. And as you know, these conferences are really expensive. So it was maybe like a $4,000 ticket or something like that. It was really crazy to me. And I just said, I am not spending company money on coming to another conference unless I know I'm sitting on a panel, I'm speaking, or there's someone that looks like me that is participating in that way. Right. So we can make those commitments, and we can be intentional that way.
I think it's great advice. Simmone, we've reached the end of our time together, sadly.
Oh, that one really fast.
I know. And we're actually a few minutes over. So there's a lot of folks that are listening right now that probably want to reach out to you. Maybe they want to ask for advice. Maybe they want to hire HeartSpace. Mm-hmm. So I assume that's okay. If so, what's your preferred method of outreach? How should people reach out to you if they're listening and they want to engage with you in some way?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm happy to share that. So my website is heartspaceny.com. Very easy, heartspaceny.com. And email is just info@heartspaceny.com.
And you'll respond?
And I will respond.
Awesome. Okay. Simmone, thanks so much for being on the Sales Hacker podcast. We've really enjoyed the conversation. If you want to reach out to Simmone, info@heartspace. Is it just heartspace.com or heartspaceny?
Heartspaceny.com.
info@heartspaceny.com and hire HeartSpace to bring both heart and intuition into the science of sales. Simmone, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Hey everybody, it's Sam's Corner, a really interesting and powerful conversation with Simmone Taitt, who runs HeartSpace NY Consulting, and we talked a lot about this question of diversity. And I think again, she mentioned the statistic. I think it's companies that embrace diversity grow at a 19% faster rate than companies that do not. So obviously, there's a powerful ROI case to embrace diversity. Diversity doesn't just mean gender, and it doesn't just mean race or ethnicity. It also means age, and it also means diversity of experiences. And one of the problems if you're solely relying on referrals to grow your company or your team is that they're going to end up referring people, most commonly, that are like them. And so you have to really be proactive about building diversity right into the top of the funnel of your hiring practice and your recruiting practice. And it's sometimes difficult to do because inertia and momentum will dictate that, if everybody loves working at your company and referrals are the cheapest, most cost-effective way of getting great hires, you want to rely on that source. But you need to push yourself to build pipelines of candidates that are not just focused on who everybody knows, but focused on a different kind of person, go where different kinds of people congregate, where they hang out, so that you can build a recruiting pipeline. The other point that Simmone made is that diversity training isn't a once-in-a-year thing. You've got to celebrate diversity on an ongoing basis. And so let's do that. Let's make sure that we don't just do diversity training once a year. I guess the final thing I'll say is that with an embrace of diversity, if you're listening out there or you're head of people, there's also got to be the corresponding openness and understanding that culture is shifting and evolving at a very rapid rate. And there needs to be a tolerance on the other side for folks that, if they bring an out-of-date perspective but are willing to be educated, that we give them that we tolerate that, and that we give them that opportunity to be educated. So much on, I don't know if you go on Twitter. I've stopped going on Twitter so much because everything is an instant condemnation of any idea that seems different or contrary without really any consideration. So, every time there's a hot piece of news, we have to immediately react to it and think about what we think, and so-and-so should resign and so-and-so should be fired. And, many times that's true, but if we want to embrace diversity, we also want to do it in a safe space, in a psychologically safe space that welcomes and embraces all kinds of new ideas and helps shepherd the folks that have older ideas into the new world. It's really, really complicated. It's hard to do. And I've been, and I've got some learning to do there myself, and I'm working on it. But I think it's a great conversation, and it's absolutely a conversation that must happen because you do bring, I know that there's a lot of folks out there that are convinced that, you hear diversity and you think some strange things to yourself. You think, I'm not a racist or I'm not a sexist, but you bring a lot of unconscious bias to different interactions. You bring ways that the world has worked for a very, very long time, and those ways may need questioning. You may need to re-examine them, and many cases, we do need to re-examine them. So it doesn't mean, walk on eggshells every time, but it does mean bring empathy into every interaction and bring authenticity and bring your heart, as Simmone talks about. That's how we're going to bridge this gap. That's how we're all going to align as a global community. So that's my spiel, and I hopefully it was insightful. And if you were offended by it or just thought it was generic bullshit, that's fine. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's linkedin.com/in and then /Sam F. Jacobs. Reach out to me. Tell me what you think. Of course, we want to thank our sponsors. Those sponsors are Outrage, the leading sales engagement platform, and Chorus, the leading conversation intelligence platform for high growth sales teams. Thanks so much for listening. We will talk to you next time.